Hello. This is a story called The Master of the Rags. A young boy entered a monastery along with the others of his generation. Unlike them, however, he had been slow and backward at school and had left without knowing how to read and write. The other boys mocked him, and he was at the point of leaving to become a wandering beggar like the other poor souls he had seen sleeping rough in doorways. One day, the abbot found him sitting with head in hands, all alone, while the other boys were practicing their lessons. He asked the boy why he had not joined them. Bursting into tears, the boy cried out, "Because I'm stupid, master. I cannot read or write, and I don't understand the questions put to me in class." The abbot looked at him for a minute and then asked, "What can you do then?" The boy thought and remembered how he had cleaned the windows of his relatives' houses and received high praise for it, the only praise in his life. Shyly he told the abbot about this. "Then you shall become my window cleaner," said the abbot. "There are many panes of glass here that need a skillful hand." So he did. On the first day he worked hard, and all the windows, especially those in the abbot's chambers, were sparkling. But that was a very dusty country, and overnight the windows became clouded again. On the second day he was lost in thought as he worked, and did not hear the abbot approach behind him. He was startled to hear his master's voice. "Where are you, my son?" asked the abbot. I don't know." "You must try to cultivate the quality of attention. From now on, when you are working, I want you to repeat these words: clear the dust, wipe it clean." From that day, the boy repeated the words to himself constantly as he worked. He began to love the sound of them in his mind, as if they were a pretty song, and before long he began to speak them, even when he was not working. He grew even better at his work, and because of the bundle of rags he carried with him, he acquired a new nickname: the Monk of the Rags. One day he was cleaning the windows in the abbot's reception rooms and repeating this mantra to himself. The door opened suddenly, and there finely dressed men came in, each followed by a servant. These two men sat in the two audience chairs, and the servants stood humbly behind. The young monk made himself as unobtrusive as possible in a corner. "Master," said one of them, "my cousins and I have come to you to mediate in a dispute." The boy turned towards the abbot and found that he was no longer sitting in his chair. The second man spoke, and the boy realized to his horror that they were addressing him, thinking he must be the famous master. Tongue-tied and frightened, the boy stood mute. "Not so much a dispute, really," said the other man, "but my rightful claim to some property which my cousin has seized without right." "That's a lie. shouted the first visitor, and both men were soon shouting and hurling insults at the other. The monk of the rags, stood still, unable to make a sound. When the shouting began to ease, one of the men looked at the boy and said, "You have heard our claims, O wise one. Which of us is entitled to the property?" The boy was caught in a moment of terrible silence, with both visitors and their servants all looking at him. Where had the master gone? The boy had never been able to give answers to questions in class, so how could he respond now? He gave the only answer that he knew, the one he had laboriously learned by heart. "Clear the dust," he heard himself say. "Wipe it clean." There was silence. All four visitors looked at him. Then, to his amazement, the two contenders fell into each other's arms, weeping. "You are indeed great, O master," one of them said, while the other nodded through his tears. "We have been looking through the dust of self-interest, but now we see clearly that nothing should come between members of a family." Thanking him profusely, they left, arm in arm. It was only then that the boy saw the abbot, peeping through the curtains at the back of the room. He seemed to be smiling. From then on, the monk was visited by many people seeking spiritual advice. He was known as the master of the rags.
Good morning, everyone. I'm sitting now talking into a camera, something I've had to get used to. But I can imagine the faces of the UUFP, and so if you'll permit me, I'll just imagine all of you sitting out there. Should I say something about the pandemic? No. I'm tired of the pandemic. I'm sure you're tired of it as well. Let's talk about things that are more hopeful. I was talking to a friend of mine recently. He's a very intelligent guy. He knows all about film and things like that. And inevitably it came into the conversation, what I do for a living. Well, as always, I could feel the mood in the room change. It always happens that way. With very few exceptions, intelligent people are not supposed to be religious. So I usually wait a while before telling people what I do. I don't want to give them a chance to weigh and measure me before the iron curtain of skepticism slams down on the conversation. I don't try to conceal it, mind you. I'm proud of what I do. When the time comes, I'll usually contribute a remark that, well, kind of blows my cover, reveals who I really am. And I did that night. And there was, as always, a look of puzzlement on his face. It also produced the same old response. "Oh, that's interesting." I suppose that it was interesting because until that very moment, he'd assumed that I was, like him, also intelligent and therefore way past that silly business of religion and God and the afterlife and all that. But after years of this, I'm really tired of making excuses, saying things like, well, we're so liberal that the Council of Churches won't have us, or Unitarians don't believe in all that stuff about heaven and hell either, just like you. Now I just let the facts settle into the relationship. Sometimes things go on interrupted, and sometimes I get the same sort of a treatment that I imagine some disabled people get, doing everything possible to avoid mentioning their little problem. Well, why should it be like this? Why should it be that you can't simultaneously have a brain and have some sort of religious sensibility? I think I know why now. It has to do with worn out stories. In the old times, when most of the world's religions were born, things were different. The earth was the center of the universe, for one thing. The world wasn't even thought yet to be round. There was so much that people didn't understand that the world seemed full of spirits and terrifying forces with no explanations, and that, of course, gave rise to stories. Well, the first stories about God probably were God being a king, very powerful, boss of the world, not necessarily cruel, but jealous and a bit capricious, so that he required a lot of flattery, a lot of sacrifice, and sometimes even human sacrifice. He was the biggest, baddest god of the lot, and being one of his followers ensured victory, give or take a few setbacks. This made perfect sense to a people dominated by powerful figures and empires. Some of that way of thinking is still around, by the way. You can see it in some of our more extreme fundamentalist churches. But things went wrong a couple thousand years ago when the Jews were subjugated and then scattered by the Romans and the Greeks. The young men of Israel were slaughtered during the Maccabean revolt. The temple at Jerusalem was burnt and then torn down. About that time, Jesus put a new spin on this religion business. He said, God's not a king. He's a loving Father. If you suffer on earth, that's ultimately okay, because heaven awaits you. This was the perfect story to give power to the coming feudal epoch when almost everybody experienced hard times and died young. You don't have to look very far to see the remains of that world and what's left of mainstream Christianity now. But we began to lose the thread of that story when science and technology made their appearance. Machines shredded the youth of both sides during the so-called Great War. The fresh air of rural farming became the smog of overcrowded cities. People finally grasped that the earth went around the sun, not vice versa. Darwin found fossils. The Holy Book began to lose its authority despite the rear-guard philosophizing of true believers. And a new story had begun to emerge, and that's the one we're in now. God has a new name: science. Science can explain everything, just give it time. Life is limited to the regeneration sequence of organs. Death has become a medical condition, not a subject of poetry and philosophical reflection. Lifespans are predictable. That means it's good to be young near the beginning and bad to be old near the end. Forget about the accumulation of wisdom that had always been attributed to elders. What was needed now was information, available with a few touches on a flat screen, and God, he took the last train for the coast. We don't need him anymore. And that's why if people suspect you're religious, they think you're weird or retarded. It's as if you've not been paying attention. It's only natural for the non-religious to think that you're still stuck in one of those other worn-out stories where God is a king or a loving father who somehow, inexplicably, allows things like cancer and infant suicide. All too often I hear the same remark from people trying to reconcile my status as a religious person to what seems to them to be a fairly intelligent mind. I'm all for religion if faith gives people comfort, you hear them say. This isn't meant to be condescending, but it is. They might as well be saying, I'm all for drugs if they take the pain away. Like marijuana being okay for glaucoma, but not for fun. The story we live in now demands a scientific and logical approach to pretty much everything. That would be fine if people just use one part of their brains, if they weren't troubled with dreams and fantasies and intuitions and hunches, deep emotions and great fears. In other words, if we were a kind of organic machine, which, well, I hate to break this to you, the prevailing worldview says that we are. But alongside the stories we've lived in, both ancient and modern, there has always existed another train of thought. And this is most often referred to as mystical or esoteric thought. It's had voices in literally every culture throughout history, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, all the Eastern religions. And this form of thought has very little to do with theology, which is what? Opinions about God. Instead of interpreting life in terms of the prevailing stories, it relies on experience and then tries to express that experience in words or in art or in music. This way of looking at things is a shortcut to truth. It leaves behind theory and doctrine and dogma and just cuts right. Sorry, a little camera glitch there with my computer. That's probably why the deep thinkers from every religious tradition wind up sounding strangely alike, despite the distance from each other in time and space. So-called mystical thinkers live within their own times, of course. So sometimes they fall afoul of their local traditions and laws. They're weirdos. One of my favorite sayings is by Hafiz, a Sufi Muslim, who said, before setting foot on the path of truth, it may be necessary to be chased out of town as a madman. I'm not a madman. At least I don't think I am. Neither are you. But I'm going to tell you something now. Something shocking. Get ready. You're all mystics. Now don't look so shocked. I'm going to prove it now because I'm going to go to the words of the unimpeachable source of all current wisdom, Wikipedia. Wikipedia defines this, mysticism, as, quote, the pursuit of communion with, identity with, or conscious awareness of an ultimate reality, divinity, spiritual truth, or God through direct experience, intuition, instinct, or insight. Mysticism usually centers on practices intended to nurture those experiences. So according to that, you're mystics because you come here, you tune in here and open your hearts and your ears, even though you know all too well I can't hand you anything. I can't give you the one and only truth. You're here knowing that the holy books can't do that either. If I had to name a single reason why you're sitting here with us this morning, I would say that you're operating on a hunch. Something that defies ordinary logic, something that flies in the face of convention because you're in the tiny percentage of people who ever do things, weird things, like go to church. Something that reaches you on a level either above or below mere logic. It used to puzzle me why new people appear in our services. They're there for a while, they sit among us, they share chat and coffee with us, and then, you know what, they disappear. Did you ever notice that? I think I can tell you why. It's because they didn't share our hunch. Maybe they wanted us to pass out certainty along with the coffee and the cookies. Or maybe unlock some secret formula for happiness, eternal life, and redemption. There are places that do that. Instead, what they got was an invitation to open their ears and their minds to peer hopefully into the unknowable mystery we call life and to follow their own unique paths. As to why we can't always fill our pews every Sunday like the fundamentalists can, the answer is simple. Weirdos like us have always been in short supply. So I'd say you're not bothered by the claims that religion is a form of delusory comfort seeking. The barely restrained sneers of the so-called new atheists who claim that they only want humanity to grow up and face reality have got no more influence on us than does the foolish repetition of the old Christian myths. That speaks of a tendency in us toward balance, toward treading a line between the opposites. Meher Baba said, spirituality is poise. I take that to mean that neither the steely logic of the rationalists nor the hyper-emotional states of the born-again attract us enough to tip us over. I think it also means that truth, hard enough to find in any case, cannot be expressed in formulas or creeds. The second part of that wonderful definition from Wikipedia is even more interesting. That's the bit about centering on practices intending to nurture those experiences. And people often ask me what it is exactly we do in our services. For years now, I've had to answer sort of lamely, well, we sing and pray and we endure sermons, aware that I'm making it sound just like any Methodist or Anglican service. I haven't been able to say what the differences are. Then I began to realize something. Over the years, I've noticed that people hear things in my sermons that I didn't actually say. Things I'm not wise enough to say. People ask me after the service for a copy of a reading, then look puzzled when they have it because the reading they heard came not from me or not from the words that I read, but from somewhere else, somewhere inside themselves. And I've noticed that a stray word picked up over coffee often seems to have conveyed a meaning and significance that trumps the sermon anyway. It's as if we come already tuned to another channel. And that channel is a special wavelength broadcast exclusively for the individual listener. If your reception is good, the message is clear. All that noise about whether God exists or not and in what form and known by what name is nothing but a distraction. What I know, what maybe all I know, is that the signal is always there, just waiting for me to tune in. And it is precisely in the company of people like you and the services and the ways we gather that helps me do that. If I were God, go with me on this. If I were God and planning a universe, here's what I'd do. I'd fill up history with amazing stories and astonishing facts. I'd pop up here and there with a bit of world-changing revelation, and I'd allow religions and kingdoms to come and go. I'd be happy to let myself be called king, and later on be called dad, and then finally science. I'd let people confuse information with wisdom and dogma with truth. And I'd just sit back and wait and watch the story unfold. But because I loved everything about my creation, that great dream from which I drew my existence, I do something lovely for every creature in it. I'd whisper to them constantly, and I'd wait for them to clear their own ears of distractions and learn how to listen. And oh yes, I'd keep places like this open so that weirdos like us have got someplace to go. Amen.